The air over Lincoln County, New Mexico, was a thick, stagnant soup of high desert heat and pulverized red dust. The August sun, a malevolent eye in the endless blue sky, cooked the earth until the horizon shimmered like a mirage. It carried the stale, metallic scent of sun-baked iron and the faint, sweet odor of mesquite smoke from yesterday's cookfires. The main street, a desolate scar across the landscape, was unnaturally quiet. Only the clank, clank, clank of the aging windmill on the edge of town, struggling against the thin, whistling wind, broke the oppressive silence of high noon. Sheriff Pat Garrett strode down the boardwalk. Tall, broad, his black duster coat seemed to swallow the light, billowing slightly behind him like a predatory bird's wings. He was the embodiment of authority, not merely wearing a star, but radiating its crushing weight. His polished, high-top boots struck the warped planks of the boardwalk with a slow, measured, and arrogant rhythm. The sound was dry, echoing the drumbeat of absolute power in the deserted street. Garrett smelled of coarse tobacco smoke, sour sweat, and the faint, heavy musk of cheap whiskey. Outside the Last Chance saloon, a man sat hunched over on a rough-hewn bench. This was Caleb, a former cowhand whose right leg had been mangled 2 years prior by a runaway horse. His right shin was atrophied, permanently bent at an awkward angle, rendering him dependent on 2 sturdy, rough-carved oak crutches. The wood was worn smooth from constant use, a testament to his daily struggle. Caleb's hands were a roadmap of thick veins and calluses, skin textured like old saddle leather, hands built for roping and riding, now only good for holding wood. He was painstakingly stitching a faded silk neckerchief, a faint, sweet scent of dried lavender escaping the fabric, a memory of his wife, who he hadn't seen since a land dispute had stranded him in town. He possessed little, but what he clung to was his meager dignity. Garrett halted directly in front of Caleb. The sheriff's imposing shadow fell across the crippled man like a shroud, instantly dropping the temperature on Caleb's exposed skin, a sudden, chilling contrast to the searing midday heat. Caleb attempted to rise as a gesture of respect, pushing against the pain, radiating a cutting cold up from his useless tibia. She couldn't. His body failed the simple required motion. The humiliation was immediate. "Morning, Sheriff Garrett," Caleb managed, his voice thin and cracked with dehydration and fear, his neck craned back sharply. Garrett offered no immediate reply. He stood over the man, studying Caleb's pale, frightened face and the bead of anxious sweat trickling down his temple. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his belt, but not for the heavy grip of his Colt .45 Peacemaker. Instead, with a sudden, vicious flick of his polished boot toe, he hooked Caleb's left crutch. The smooth oak slipped easily, flying out into the main street's thick dust with a dull, echoing thwack. Caleb immediately lost his precarious balance, pitching sideways and landing awkwardly in the gritty, hot dust. A small gasp of pain escaped him, but the sound was overwhelmed by the crushing sting of his profound shame. With a leisurely kick, Garrett sent the second crutch sailing upward, landing it with a muffled clang on the corrugated tin roof of the saloon. "You'll have to crawl now, cripple," Pat Garrett drawled, the words heavy and slow. He noticed the single, silent tear that traced a clean line through the dust on Caleb's cheek. "That's the law in New Mexico. If you ain't fit to walk, don't inconvenience those who are." The sheriff let out a brief, guttural laugh, a sound that seemed fundamentally wrong in the desert's charged silence. He stepped deliberately over Caleb's bowed form and pushed through the saloon's swinging doors. Miles away, atop a rise where the skeletal fingers of the agave cacti reached towards the sky, a young man sat motionless on a bay horse. His black Stetson hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that was youthful but already etched with the harsh lines of constant wind and impending danger. It was Billy the Kid, William H. Bonney. He was not hurrying. He simply paused, the metallic butt plate of his Winchester Model 1873 leaning against his shoulder. From his vantage point, he could just catch the faint, bitter scent of saloon coffee and the iron tang of disturbed dust drifting from the town. He could not make out the tier, but he saw the distinct outline of a man deliberately crushed. They watched, the slow-growing agave, their thick, spiky leaves symbolizing the painful resilience of the land, served as silent, ancient witnesses. The wind's mournful whistle through the few gaps in the wooden structures was a sad, constant melody of the frontier. Billy the Kid slowly nudged his horse forward, stepping over a stretch of loose, dusty, barbed wire that marked the city limits. A crude, physical boundary, representing a choice about which law to follow. The saloon's swinging door, the psychological frontier between civil space and savagery, stood open, an invitation for either legal justice or violent retribution. The shadows were lengthening. Night would bring a new rule, his rule, only if you want it to be. The dust settled, but the faint sound of Garrett's laughter lingered on the air, a poisonous, lingering threat. The kid felt the rough, dry texture of his horse's mane under his gloves. He rode on. Night had enveloped Lincoln, bringing with it a deceptive, sharp cold that bit through even thick wool, a stark contrast to the day's brutal heat. In the small, single-story boarding house, the comforting, earthy aroma of thick bean stew and burning pine wood from the small hearth filled the cramped air. Billy, the kid, sat on the edge of a plain wooden chair, positioned beside Caleb, who lay motionless in a simple, narrow bed. The discarded oak crutches now rested against the wall, silent wooden skeletons against the peeling wallpaper. The only light came from the flickering, warm, orange glow of the dying fireplace. "He likes to see us crawl, Sheriff Garrett does," Caleb whispered, his voice still hoarse, ragged with shame and residual fear. "He told me if I couldn't stand, I wasn't worth the bother. He is a cruel man, not just a mean one." Billy was meticulously cleaning his derringer, the small two-shot pocket pistol he favored for its close-range intimidation and surprising accuracy, more often used for emphasis than for a main fight. The cold, smooth steel of the weapon was a welcome, familiar sensation against Billy's calloused hands, which were rough and ridged from a lifetime of handling rope and reins. "I saw it all. The sheriff. He is a big man, yes," Billy replied, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Big in power, yes," Caleb confirmed, nodding weakly. "My name is Caleb McCord. I was a dirt farmer. My quarrel isn't with the law, partner. It's with petty malice. I owed a small note to Colonel Ignazio, nothing I couldn't pay. Garrett came to ensure I lost everything, not just to collect. I lost my horse, I lost my land. All that remains is this old paper." Caleb carefully reached beneath his thin, scratchy linen pillow and pulled out a brittle, yellowed scrap of document. It was the land deed, a fragile piece of parchment that represented his entire claim to existence, his autonomy, his future, the spot where he planned to be buried. It was the ultimate symbol of his lost, and now reviled, dignity. The texture of the old paper was dry and thin, almost dissolving at the edges. "This land ain't worth much, kid, but it's mine. It's where I belong, dead or alive," Caleb insisted, holding the deed protectively. "Garrett tried to force me to sign it over, to give up the last scrap. She couldn't. Now he humiliates me in the street, an act of sheer malice to break my spirit where the town could see." Billy took the deed, handling the dry, delicate paper with surprising gentleness. The small wooden door to the room, the internal frontier separating their private refuge from the hostile world outside, rattled softly in the persistent wind. The sound was a constant low threat. "That man took more from you than just those sticks of wood," Billy observed, his eyes cold and hard. "He took your respect, sir. That debt is only paid in lead and blood." Caleb coughed, a dry, rasping sound deep in his chest. "He is the sheriff. He's friend to every judge and every wealthy man from here to Santa Fe. He's got an army of deputies. I saw the fear in every soul out there. They watched him do it, and they did nothing. They dared not move a muscle. Fear, Caleb, is the finest harvest for a tyrant," Billy stated, smoothly reholstering the derringer in his vest pocket. The metal was now warm from the heat of his body. "Sheriff Pat Garrett is a rotten lawman, and I am Billy the Kid. The sheriff has the badge and the law books. I possess the instinct for survival." Billy rose to his feet. The tension in his slight frame held taut, like a newly strung guitar wire. He turned toward the oak crutches leaning against the wall. He picked one up, assessing its rough texture and solid weight. It was strong, built to bear a man's full weight, yet it had been rendered useless by a simple kick. "I'm going to bring these back to you, Caleb. But first, I'm going to make certain that before he lays a hand on this oak again, Pat Garrett understands precisely what it means to crawl. Vengeance ain't an easy road, partner. The path is long and littered with bones. Only if you want it to be." Caleb echoed the familiar phrase, but this time it held a fragile, desperate hope. That night, a series of short, sharp rifle shots ripped through the silence on the outskirts of town. Billy the Kid, using the cover of the cold, deep desert night, ambushed two of Garrett's patrols. There were no immediate fatalities, only wounded men and the sound of stolen horses galloping away. It was a clear, dramatic declaration of war. Billy left a note soaked in the blood of a deputy. "Tell Pat Garrett he has something that belongs to me. Let him come and fetch it. BK." Sheriff Pat Garrett was now the hunter, but Billy the Kid, the outlaw, had sworn a sacred vow of honor that would violently redefine the line between justice and barbarism in the vast, unforgiving expanse of New Mexico territory. The small, symbolic crutch of oak was now the most important piece of evidence in the entire territory. 3 days later, the sun sat lower in the sky than the previous episodes, yet the dry heat remained intensely oppressive, an atmospheric weight that pressed down on the men. Billy the Kid and his small band, Doc, a former mountain man, deadly accurate with his heavy Winchester Model 1886, and Charlie, a half-breed cowboy, a near-mythical master tracker, had made camp deep within a tight, dust-choked box canyon. The only sign of life, besides the men, were the giant, resilient agave plants clinging stubbornly to the rock faces, growing agonizingly slow, symbolizing the unforgiving nature of the land. The faint, lingering scent of spent gunpowder and dry sagebrush, crushed underfoot, hung close to the canyon floor. The wind screamed through the narrow rock passages, a mournful, haunting sound that reinforced their isolation and vulnerability. "The sheriff ain't foolish, kid. He knows you ain't out here for the reward money," Doc said, carefully examining the smooth, dark bore of his Winchester. His fingers, strong and scarred, moved with mechanical precision. "He's hunting you because you slapped his dignity." "He noticed," Billy acknowledged, taking a long, bitter swig of cold coffee brewed hours ago, the taste sharp and metallic on his tongue. "Garrett values a man's respect less than a rattlesnake values water. He stripped a lame man's pride in the street, Doc. That ain't law, it's pure meanness, and meanness draws a price." Charlie knelt low, meticulously examining the subtle patterns in the loose, dry sand. His hands were extremely thick, the texture of his skin rough as old, dried animal hide. He lifted his head, sniffing the thin air with the practiced ease of a predator. "We're close to the line, the Apache border," Charlie whispered, his voice hushed and reverent. The shifting sand felt gritty under his fingernails. The Apache tribes held the higher ground, their presence a constant brooding threat to the white settlers. The border between their people and the encroaching Americans was a tense, fragile line, perpetually marked by broken treaties and intermittent violence. Billy the Kid, however, had a complex, pragmatic history of respectful non-aggression with certain outlying clans. "Garrett will use his law to hunt us down, but I need more than the law. I need the desert to be my ally," Billy declared. He gazed intently at the spiky agave plant growing nearby, its thick, formidable leaves reaching stiffly toward the harsh sky. The agave had become his personal symbol of autonomy and stubborn survival in this merciless territory, a plant that grew slow and hard, but asked no man's permission to exist. The air thrummed with unspoken potential, a deep, pervasive silence loaded with consequence. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sound, not the wind nor the movement of rock. It was a high, piercing cry, the perfect mimicry of a hawk's call. Charlie instantly raised his head, his eyes narrowed, searching the canyon rims. "That's the signal, the passage sign," Charlie whispered, confirming the shared knowledge. "They know we're here. They have been observing us since we entered the canyon." Billy smoothly drew his primary weapon, the Colt 45 single-action army. He knew a confrontation was imminent, but he hoped the enemy was not Garrett, at least not yet. "We move forward. I want their permission, not their blood," Billy commanded, his tone firm. They advanced carefully into the deepest crevice of the canyon. In a small, shadowed grotto, 2 Apache warriors awaited them. Their buckskin vests were rough and smelled faintly of wood smoke, and their faces were painted with geometric ochre designs. They wore soft, silent moccasins that rendered their movements completely soundless. "Our tracks are the tracks of men who bleed easily." The lead Apache warrior stated his name was Lone Crow, his voice deep, resonating with a quiet power. "Yes, my name is Billy. I seek the passage," Billy responded, holding Lone Crow's gaze, offering respect but showing no fear. "I do not seek to hunt in your land. I seek justice against a white sheriff who strips the dignity from the weak among his own." Lone Crow studied Billy, evaluating the sincerity and the strange code of honor in the young gunslinger's eyes. They watched the polished Colt 45 in Billy's hand and the intense, almost childlike gravity of the outlaw's stare. "The white man's justice smells of burnt powder and broken promises," Lone Crow said, tilting his head slightly. "The desert offers justice only if the spirit is strong enough to accept it. The passage, only if you want it to be." The answer, hanging in the tense air, was an ambiguous frontier. Lone Crow's final decision, based on Billy's perceived spiritual strength and respect, would be the only thing standing between the outlaw and Garrett's heavily armed, vengeful posse. It was a stark, high-stakes cliffhanger that placed the white man's pursuit of law against the ancient, unwritten code of the high desert. The early morning sun, still low, merely grazed the canyon walls, but the air within the Apache camp was surprisingly cool, infused with the sharp, clean scent of burning sage and damp, packed earth. The cultural exchange was fraught with high tension, but governed by profound mutual respect. Billy the Kid was not there to fight, but to refine his ability to fight, to learn the deep survivalist instincts of the indigenous people. Lone Crow led Billy away from the main camp to a small, hidden natural spring, a true oasis nestled between massive granite boulders. The water was icy cold, a miraculous contrast to the dry, choking heat that dominated the external world. The air here was thicker, carrying the delicate scent of moist earth and wild mint. "The sheriff has men, he has powerful weapons, you have only rage. Rage is merely fire that burns itself out," Lone Crow instructed, his voice low and steady. "You must learn the strength of patience, the calm of the stone." The test was deceptively simple. Lone Crow placed a small, smooth piece of dry river clay on the ground. "Retrieve it," the Apache warrior commanded. Billy dropped low, ready to snatch the clay with his quick hands. Just as his fingers brushed the piece, Lone Crow swung a thick piece of carved cottonwood, a blunt bat, through the air, stopping it inches from Billy's head. Billy instantly flinched back, the sharp whoosh of the air movement and the near-contact shock sending a sharp, cold jolt through his body. He noticed that his speed, usually his greatest asset, had been rendered useless by his predictable focus on the target. "You are fast, but your eyes fixate on the prize, not on the unseen danger. Your instinct is to rush. The woman you loved, she couldn't have warned you, because your body was already committed to motion." Lone Crow analyzed, his assessment brutal in its accuracy. They repeated the exercise dozens of times. Each attempt ended in Billy's failure. His hands became slick with sweat, and then caked with a gritty, rough paste of dust and perspiration. The heavy scent of his own fear and effort mingled with the sagebrush. He was forced to breathe the hot, dry air of self-doubt. Meanwhile, Pat Garrett and his remaining 10 deputies relentlessly closed the distance. Garrett, heavy in his thick, heat-absorbing wool vest, felt the sun burning against the back of his neck. He reeked of stale whiskey and newly oiled leather. He was consumed by corrosive irritation. "That boy is making me waste precious time, and I'll make him pay for every damn minute," Garrett snarled to his second-in-command, wiping the sweat from his eye with the back of his hand. "He thinks he can outrun the badge." "He's the kid, Sheriff. He's known for being treacherous," the deputy warned, nervously checking his own Sharps rifle. "Treacherous? He's a boy who's never truly crawled before." Garrett sneered, forcing a cough of dry, bitter laughter. "I will teach him how to crawl. I'll make him beg for those sticks." Back at the spring, Billy approached the test once more. This time he did not look at the clay. He focused on the empty space, on the silence that preceded movement. He did not move to grab, he moved to evade. The instant the Cottonwood Club began its movement, Billy had already scooped the clay, his hand a blur, his body reacting to the shift in the environment, not the visual target. "You saw the silence," Lone Crow declared, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "The justice of the desert is slow, but it is flawless. You must acknowledge the heat of your rage, but never allow it to blind your sight." Lone Crow presented Billy with a small, meticulously carved bone pendant of a hunting eagle. The eagle flies high, but her eye sees the smallest movement on the ground. Use your sight. The frontier to your new path is your own mind. They watched, the other Apache men in the grotto, and the savage, indifferent nature itself, which had judged Billy and found him worthy of the lesson. Billy departed, offering a deep bow of respect. He and his gang rode hard, applying the new lesson. Patience precedes speed. Sheriff Garrett, in his frantic pursuit, was focused entirely on velocity. Billy the Kid was focused entirely on the instinctual moment. The scene was thick with imminent danger. Garrett was perhaps less than an hour behind them. Lone Crow's final, cryptic phrase echoed across the rocks. "The frontier of true peril. Only if you want it to be." Billy understood. The path of vengeance was a choice, not a destiny. The cinematic pace now transitioned into a grinding, high-octane gear. The tension, previously a slow atmospheric build, turned physical, a palpable pressure in the environment. Billy the Kid and his reduced band had set a meticulous, desperate ambush within a narrow, twisting passage known locally as the Trail of Broken Stones. The sharp, resinous scent of dry cedar and pine was powerful here, a confusing, clean smell in the middle of the desert. The dust kicked up by their horses settled into a fine, choking red haze, obscuring the precise line of sight. Garrett and his deputies, their confidence boosted by their sheer numbers, followed the clear, visible trail. Garrett had the official, printed map of the region, but Billy, utilizing Lone Crow's teachings, had the deeper, internal instinct of the territory. Trust the silence, not the map. Sheriff Pat Garrett, sweating profusely within his thick wool vest, felt the unyielding heat pressing on the back of his neck. The heavy, sharp smell of iron and sweat saturated his clothing. His frustration was a visible, toxic cloud. He craved the immediate, total humiliation of the kid. "Slow down on the trail, Sheriff. It's too tight and treacherous," warned one of the younger, more nervous deputies. Garrett's lips pulled back in a thin, cold smile. "I make my own trails, deputy." The moment Garrett and his men entered the gorge, the thick silence shattered. The loud, sharp crack of Doc's powerful Winchester was the opening shot, dry and deafening. 2 horses instantly crumpled and fell, their bodies creating an immediate, impassable barricade in the narrowest part of the canyon. The pursuit dissolved instantly into a chaotic, close-quarters firefight. The heavy, thunderous roar of the Colt 45s echoed and rebounded off the hard rock faces, confusing and distorting the origin point of the ambush. Billy the Kid was positioned high above, using the deep shade and natural camouflage. He deliberately aimed not to kill initially, but to sow maximum panic and disorganization. He moved with the fluid, silent grace of a desert animal, his calloused hands reloading his handgun with astonishing, practiced speed. Garrett quickly realized the lethal nature of the trap. He noticed the deadly silence that punctuated the sporadic bursts of gunfire, the certain sign that the enemy was not merely shooting, but studying his movements, waiting for the fatal mistake. "He's not here to wipe us out. He's here to take me," Garrett roared, his face mottled with raw hatred and fear. The deputies struggled to find cover behind the small, scattered boulders. They watched the dust and the danger, but their fear of the relentless, invisible fire paralyzed several of them. The tension in the canyon was as physically thick as the rough, gritty texture of the stone they clung to. One deputy, grazed by a shot, cried out and stumbled. Billy the Kid emerged briefly from a rock formation, running in a low, sharp zigzag, firing a focused final shot at the engine of Garrett's small supply wagon. The resultant explosion was not large, but it was enough to spray thick, stinging smoke and debris, escalating the confusion to outright terror. Garrett caught a brief glimpse of Billy and fired his own Colt 45 wildly. The shot flew past Billy's head by mere inches. Billy dropped immediately to the canyon floor, his tactical mission already achieved. His goal was not to win a full-scale battle, but to draw Garrett into a singular high-stakes duel. "You damned kid! Get back here and face the law!" Garrett bellowed, his voice choked with impotence and frustrated rage. Billy offered no reply. He and his small group withdrew, taking two of Garrett's last remaining fresh horses, leaving the sheriff effectively stranded in the choking, cedar-scented canyon. Garrett was left only with the stench of his own sweat and the acrid smoke of failure. The foot pursuit continued for 2 more desperate, fruitless hours until Garrett lost Billy's trail entirely in a wide, dry wash. Garrett, soaking wet with exertion and fury, dismounted his horse. His thick, painful fingers curled around the grip of his empty holster. He looked east, where the sun was finally beginning its slow, dramatic descent, painting the sky with violent streaks of red and orange. The official law was being systematically outfought and outmaneuvered by the outlaw's superior instinct. "Billy," Garrett muttered, his voice barely audible, thick with vengeance. "You will crawl, I swear it." The final intense cliffhanger was the clear, sharp call of a hawk coming from the deep mountainside. It was the Apache signal. Billy the Kid was now securely on their land, protected or at the very least observed. The final symbolic frontier, the duel, was now inevitable. The final stage was set back in Lincoln as the day bled into twilight. The air was turning sharply cold, carrying the contrasting smells of freshly brewed coffee from the only open diner and the unsettling metallic odor of the dust that had been disturbed by violence. The tension was the only warm, pervasive force left in the town. Garrett, raw with fury, defeat, and profound humiliation, rode slowly back into the town limits. He was alone, his authority stripped down to just the badge on his chest. He knew, with the cold certainty of instinct, that Billy would not run far. He was waiting. Billy the Kid stood directly in front of the Last Chance saloon. He had placed Caleb's 2 rough-hewn oak crutches side by side, leaning prominently against the saloon's entrance, a deliberate physical sign of Garrett's original sin and the man's recovered autonomy. The saloon door, the symbolic frontier of choice and consequence, was closed, but left intentionally unlatched. The silence was now so heavy and unnatural that the quiet jingle of Garrett's heavy spurs sounded like the tolling of a great bell. He walked, dragging his body with heavy effort toward Billy. "You made a fatal error, boy," Garrett snarled, his hands hovering, ready to draw. "The error was yours, Sheriff. You tore the self-respect from a helpless man," Billy countered, his youthful face strikingly calm. He smelled faintly of dry sage. The law of the desert is absolute. You can steal a life, but you cannot steal a man's honor without paying the highest price. Honor? She couldn't pay for those sticks. Honor doesn't pay my wages. Garrett sneered, attempting a final psychological strike. No, but it will make you crawl. The final duel was instantaneous and brutally efficient. The two men stood motionless for a pregnant moment, the silence stretched thin and ready to snap. They watched, the few citizens who dared to peer through the dusty glass windows. Billy moved first, with the blurring speed and surgical precision taught by Lone Crow. His Colt 45 roared twice, the sound echoing painfully in the empty street. The first shot shattered Garrett's gun hand, knocking the weapon from his grasp. The second shot struck his kneecap. Pat Garrett gasped, the cry of pain trapped savagely in his throat. He pitched forward, falling immediately onto his knees in the dry, unforgiving dust. The sheriff, the mighty symbol of law, was instantly reduced to the living image of the man he had so casually, so cruelly humiliated. Billy walked slowly toward Garrett, his approach devoid of rage, possessing only a detached, surgical calm. He stopped directly over the massive man. "The official justice is weak and far away, Sheriff. This is the justice of the unforgiving desert. You will crawl now," Billy stated, his voice flat and final. Billy took the two oak crutches and dropped them deliberately beside Garrett's injured form. The rough wood landed with a soft thud. "Take them. Use them. But remember who delivered them back into this street," Billy commanded. Garrett, his hand bleeding freely and his leg useless, attempted to scrabble, to haul himself toward the crutches. He clawed at the dust, humiliated, the strong, raw scent of his own blood, and the dry earth filling his nostrils. He was a pathetic, broken figure. He was the complete inverse of his former self. He was finally forced to crawl towards Caleb's crutches. The surprising and emotional conclusion. Caleb, now standing unaided, having recovered his physical balance and his dignity, and helped by Charlie, walked out from the boarding house door, a physical transition across a symbolic frontier. He saw Garrett, the sheriff, crawling in the street, but his eyes were not filled with satisfying vindication, but with a profound, almost tragic sadness. He had lost a piece of his own soul to demand this payment. Billy approached Caleb and placed the brittle, valuable land deed back into his calloused hand. "It is yours, Caleb. No man will ever take it from you again." "And Pat Garrett?" Caleb asked, his gaze fixed on the broken man. Billy looked down at Garrett, who was painfully propping himself up on one of the crutches, struggling vainly to regain a fraction of his lost height. "He is not dead, but he knows now what it is to crawl," Billy said. "In the desert, death is often the easy way out, utter humiliation. That is hell itself." Billy turned his back on the scene and faced the dark, looming mountains, where the agave stood silent and permanent. "You brought the balance back, kid," Caleb said, wiping a tear from his eye, a tear of complex emotion. Billy mounted his horse. He looked at the border of the town, the unlatched door of the saloon. The law had been forcefully applied, but the act of violence was not glorified. It had served only to violently restore a necessary, unwritten moral order. "Peace is possible, Caleb," Billy declared, his head held high, looking toward a horizon now painted with the dark, reflective colors of the finished day. "Only if you want it to be." Caleb echoed the final phrase, the words now full of a complicated, hard-won wisdom. Garrett's public crawl had granted them both a choice, a chance to build something new based on the painful survival and respect among all men, even those outside the law. Billy the Kid and his companions rode slowly into the deep, cold darkness of the desert. The only sounds, the soft jingle of their spurs, and the perpetual whistling wind, which carried away the dust and the shameful legacy of a sheriff who had finally learned, through pain, what it meant to have one's honor ripped away. The justice administered was complex, brutal, but undeniably earned.